be able to find it. So I'm Michaela. I'm the founder and CEO of Reverb. We do HR consulting, management and leadership development, and executive coaching. We work mostly with startups and scale-ups. Right now, we are just trying to do anything that we think will be helpful to people, keeping people connected, helping folks manage anxiety, figure out how to work with remote teams. And as we know, inclusion is actually more important now than ever, I think, given the situation that we're in, given that we're distributed, and we really need to hear all voices and make all connections. So I'm thrilled to have Cheryl Ingram joining us today. If you want to say hi, Cheryl.
Hi,
Yay, thank you so much for being here. And I don't know how everyone's been feeling. I feel like everything feels really extra heavy to me this week, even compared to past weeks. I think just as this is prolonged, and some of the fun of like, let's do a Zoom happy hour, like that was fun, and let's share some, crafts that kids can make at home, and how many things can we bake? But now it's like, it's still going on, right? I think it's feeling heavy. And one thing you're gonna love about Cheryl is she brings a lot of humor and a lot of energy. So I'm hoping today is gonna kind of lift you out of that haze for a moment. Basically what we're gonna do, I'm just gonna ask Cheryl to introduce herself. She is the founder and CEO of 2 companies. I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those companies. Ideally, we just want to open this up for questions. So this time is yours to use however you like and whatever you want to get out of it. If we're short on questions for any reason, I have a few of my own, but think of your questions now because Cheryl's a wealth of information. So with that, Cheryl, I will have you kick us off.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michaela and team. Thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Cheryl Ingram, but you can just call me Cheryl. I'm the CEO of 2 companies. Like Michaela said, I own a company called Diversity, and it is a professional services company. Our mission is to eliminate discrimination and oppression within all institutions. We do diversity, equity, and inclusion assessments and training and strategy and coaching now. I've hired some coaches. And we really work to make sure that human beings in the workplace are not being discriminated against. And if they are, our goal is to use a lot of data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, to inform practice so that we can really change the outcomes and experiences that human beings face in the workplace based on their identity. Inclusology was actually born out of Diversity, but it is its own separate company. Inclusology is a small tech company that is a SaaS platform. And what we do is we use automation in order to create real-time solutions after we do assessments for people in HR who are struggling in diversity, equity, and inclusion, or any diversity champion that loves data. And so that came into fruition because I was really tired of running assessments that took a really long time. And what that meant is that the longer we took to assess and create solutions, the longer human beings were struggling in the workplace. And so we created Inclusology to use artificial intelligence to really create fast and real-time solutions, but also really informed strategies for people to have in real time through our platform. So you can run an employee engagement assessment, you can get comparisons to how you perform against other companies in your industry in different aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you even get a strategic plan all through artificial intelligence and Inclusology.
That's amazing. So I'm going to start us off with the first question, which is, how do I know if my culture is inclusive? And let's assume, I think we all know if our culture is toxic, right? So I'm not talking about those cultures, but I'm talking about a culture that, maybe it looks and feels pretty good. It's a place that you enjoy working, but maybe you've never asked yourself that particular question, Cheryl. So where should somebody start?
Right. Great question, Michaela. With so many different answers, I have to sit up in my chair. So one of the ways that I want to first address the myths, because I think that people think that if they feel safe in the workplace, that their workplace is inclusive. And that's not the case. And so there are a few things that you can do depending on what your position is to measure whether or not your company is indeed starting to practice inclusion and meeting its goals. The first is usually if you are a person who is in an entry or mid to entry level position, one of the things that you can look at is your strategic plan. right? Or your policies and your practices, employee handbooks, strategic plans, your mission, your vision, your values that are in your company. If they don't have some sort of presence of inclusion in some way, shape, or form, meaning that they don't translate you feeling respected, not just are respected and welcome, but even beyond that, you feel like you have been given an opportunity to grow without barriers in your company, right? And so we will break that down a little bit more as we continue to answer questions. I'm sure you'll all have more questions about that. But if you go and you look at those things and you don't feel like there's any presence of inclusion or inclusion of you, then your company's probably not as inclusive as you think it is, right? And so I would say start there. If you are an executive or a leader, one of the main things we tell people to look at, and this is very materialistic but necessary, is your profit and loss statement, okay? Because if you think about how you are distributing money in order to support different programs that support different people in your workplace, and you don't have programs that help, or not even programs, but yeah, that perpetuate inclusion, then perhaps you know that your workplace is not as inclusive as it needs to be. And then that means that your job is to start to redistribute what those funds look like so that you are creating a space where you are creating equity, not just through resources in your workplace. So that's another way. And the next is when you create goals, right? If you have run an employee assessment and you're not measuring the voice of all the different identities in your workplace, you're not practicing inclusion, because depending on someone's identity, they will tell you how they experience the workplace differently than someone who doesn't share in those identities. And so your goal is, when you're looking at data, especially in an assessment, you want to take the overall data of your workplace, and then you want to do a comparative analysis to differentiate how identities answer questions compared to how overall your workplace answers questions. If you find gaps in the data, then you know that you're not as inclusive as you need to be. And let me say this as well, that is hard to do. Inclusion is like change. It's always evolving. If your workplace is evolving, your inclusive practices should be evolving. So grant yourself some grace, but also be very aware of the different levels of inclusion that might evolve over time in your workplace.
Okay, there was some exciting background noise. Cheryl, so quotable. I love this is going to be recorded, actually, because I'm going to quote you like 10 times, even from the first answer that you gave. So I know I'm personally intrigued by this whole notion of measurement and measuring inclusion, because often it feels like something soft, like you're saying, it's a feeling. Do I feel included? Do I feel that my voice was being heard? And I think in general, people have struggled with how to measure diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? There are some ways that just measure like how many people of a certain identity, race, or gender, which don't always feel like good goals, or people feel like, well, I don't know, somehow those numbers aren't really meaningful or don't track back to the actions that people are taking or the actual sentiment within an organization. So maybe just give us some examples of what does it mean to measure inclusion, and what does that look like?
Right. All right, so I always go, you'll notice some of my patterns are the do's and the don'ts, okay? Because I like to call out when people say, well, we're inclusive, because they've started to accomplish one goal that they've set out, which means that inclusion is growing, but it might not make you inclusive. So when you are measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially inclusion, there's 4 particular genres that you need to focus on in your company that break down into 14 subcategories, okay? I'm giving you some free consultation here, so take it for what it's worth, y'all. But the first one is foundation. And what foundation is in your company is that means what is driving your strategy. Now, there are usually 3 things that drive a strategy within your company. The first is vision, for where you are headed and what you want to accomplish. For example, you are a technology company and you track people's locations, then maybe your vision is to create a system that tracks all human beings, no matter what their identities, to make sure that they get to a location safely, okay? If that is your vision, that's got some inclusion in it because you are thinking about different identities. The next part of the foundation is leadership, right? So you need to measure your leadership. And when I say measure your leadership, you need to think about diversity and inclusion within that. So what that means is, what does your leadership look like? And not just visibly, but also invisibly, like, right? What are their beliefs? What are their goals? What are their attitudes? And then how is your company structured? So that means, like, are you in a flat structure in a company? Is it a hierarchy? What is the foundation for which your company is being built on? That's the first set of measuring inclusion. The next is focuses on internal, okay? And what internal is how do you attract and retain people? And so when you are thinking about attracting and retaining people, there are 4 specific areas for inclusion that you need to be measuring. The first is recruitment and development. And the second is benefits, okay? And then the third is compensation. So you're probably doing some sort of pay equity, et cetera. And then the third is the learning opportunities that you have created for employees that are accessible in an equitable way. That's internal. So remember, you have 2 right now. You have foundation, which drives your strategy. And then you have internal, which is how you attract and retain people. The next is what we call bridging, right? And for anyone who wants to know, I use the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmark and the Diversity and Inclusion Index as part of the resources that inform our process. And so what I'm quoting are directly from those 2 sources. The third one is bridging and aligning. And that means, how do you align in your company and how do you connect with employees, okay? And there's 3 particular subcategories in those areas. The first one is assessment. And for anyone who's wondering about assessment, let me tell you what assessment looks like. So it could be a third-party anonymous survey. It could be an internal employee engagement survey. It could be interviews. It could be individual and focus group interviews. It could be looking at historical data that you have tracked over time, especially if you are in human resources, and bringing all of that data together, okay? Because if you are a company who's practicing inclusion, one of the most inclusive methods of measuring data is a mixed method. That means that you're using both qualitative and quantitative, because there are things that employees will tell you through technology that they may not tell you face-to-face, and there are things that employees will tell you face-to-face that they may not tell you through a technical medium, all right? The next in bridging is communication. So how do you communicate with your employees? And how do they communicate with you, especially if you are in leadership, and how they communicate with one another? And then sustainability. How sustainable is your company, right? And that could be the policies and practices that you have. How sustainable are they? Are people practicing them? How financially stable are you? All of these things matter when you're talking about bridging something in your company. And tell me to slow down. If I'm speaking, please tell me, don't ask me to repeat, because I tend to speak very, very quickly. And last but not least is the external. When we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, usually the populations that we tend to serve should be reflective of the populations who are in our workplaces, right? And our policies and practices, even our designation of resources, has to impact those communities, has to reflect those communities, because it impacts those communities. And so when you're talking about it external, what that means is, how do you listen to and serve society? And there's 4 ways that companies do that. They do that through social responsibility programs. They do that through products and services. You do it through your marketing, and you do it through supplier diversity, right? And so I'm going to quiz y'all after I get done in the chat. So there are 4 areas: the foundation, internal, bridging, and external. And I'll pause there to see if anyone has any questions before I quiz y'all.
Oh yeah, see, Kylie gave them the cheat sheet right there.
Well done.
The other thing, Cheryl, so we're happy to share some links as we go. I always get the acronym wrong, but the Global Diversity, it's GDIB, the benchmarking, right? And I think Kylie, you can find the link for that as well. Well, that was an excellent overview. And I think everyone is recognizing right now, if you didn't before, that we are going to cover a lot. So we're just scratching the surface here, kind of giving you some resources, giving you some food for thought, and there's a lot more. And I'll take that moment too to highlight Diversity LLC. Cheryl has a fantastic YouTube channel where there's videos, skits, right? There's some fun skits about, well, Cheryl, I'll let you speak to it, but I know like the microaggressions, and she's turned it into, it's very educational and informative. It's also fun and funny, so very easy to watch and take in.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michaela. And I really love that you said that because it made me reflect on something that I forgot to say. And I think I just forgot to say what it was again. So, oh, here we go. So another way of measuring inclusion through human resources is looking at how many complaints based on discrimination come through your HR department or your managers, right? Because if people are complaining about feeling discriminated against, then more than likely it's written somewhere, it's been tracked somewhere by someone in some way, shape, or form. So make sure you are doing that. We have a diversity LLC. It's how you type it in, city, CITY, diversity. Um, and we created content to help people think about what discrimination looks like in action. So we've created skits, we've put resources on there, they're free for everyone. And the reason that we did that, we started out, and you'll see that our learning series has evolved over time. It started out with just me talking to the camera and giving you examples and breaking things down for you. And then we realized that needed to evolve to a space where people see what it looks like in action, and then they have the tools to be able to deal with it if and when it happens. And so if you go check out our YouTube channel, we bring lots of content. I think we have close to 100 or so videos now, and different resources on there for you on everything from microaggressions to unconscious bias to explicit bias to LGBTQ plus inclusivity. So go check us out.
100 videos, that's amazing. That was really amazing. I want to go back to something you said, because I want to make sure this is really concrete for people. You talked about looking at the P&L. You talked about the team needs to reflect the customer. Can you share one or two specific examples of misses people might have if their team or their leadership does not look like the customer?
Oh yeah, definitely. So it some gaps that might exist if your leadership does not look like your customer usually start in recruitment, right? And so some of the things that you might have missed, for example, we'll start with could be your job description. It could be that you're using language in your job description that is not inclusive of multiple identities, right? And so we have to be very mindful with the way that we exhibit language in the things that we put out into the world. So your job descriptions, your company's advertisements, the language that you use, people pay attention to those things. And so first, I would say start there. The second is with your recruiters. If you are a company that has recruiters, you may or may not. If you have a company specifically that has recruiters, this is for you. So we have to train recruiters how to go out and recruit populations without bias. And what that means is that when recruiters go out to recruit populations, there's a ton of affinity bias that tends to happen within companies. Now that could be a pro and a con for you. And let me tell you why before y'all start to trip on me a little bit. So I'm saying that affinity bias could be a good thing and a bad thing, because if you have gaps where you don't see representation in leadership that exists in your communities, what that means is that representation probably doesn't exist within your recruiters. And so the reason that that's a con is because recruiters may be going out and recruiting people who they have shared identities with. So whether or not that's where they come from, what they look like, gender identity, sexual orientation, and we don't even realize sometimes that we do that. It's just our natural comfort zone. So that's where we tend to gravitate towards, right? The pro about it is if you do have diverse recruiters, then you probably have diverse leadership, which means that inclusion is happening more. And I'm not just saying visible diversity. I think that people see me, they see a Black woman, and when they hear the word diversity, they think that that is my lane. And it is one lane that I exist in proudly, but it's not my only lane. So let me be clear about that. What I'm saying is that you need to have multiple identities that multiple human beings have, and your recruiters don't need to be homogenous. Because if they are, then your workplace is probably homogenous. Or if you're a company who hires firms to hire leaders, especially executives, you need to look at those identities that exist within the firms, and you need to look at the core values that exist within those firms, because those firms could be perpetuating the same thing that a direct recruiter might be perpetuating without even realizing that it's happening. Another way that you can find gaps is, when I talked about language, is when you have leaders who say things like, we just want the best person for the job. I'll never forget, I'll share a quick story. We have a company right now who is a billion-dollar company, multi-billion-dollar company. And I was speaking to one of their leaders, and we were having a conversation, and I was training them about how to become an executive champion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm laughing, but I promise y'all, I was not laughing at the time when he said what he said. So I go into the conversation with him and four other executives, all white males. And he says, I just want to hire the best man for the job. And I was like, what? I was like, pause, wait a second, stop the training. I was like, do you realize what it is that you just said? And he said, yeah. I said, I just want to hire. And then he paused and he looked at me. I said, that's the problem, right? Because you want to hire the best person for the job, but you don't even realize how bias can manifest in your language. And so that's one of the things that I don't think people really pay attention to, that's highly overlooked. So when you have companies like Textio who are building technology in order to help people remove biased language from their recruitment process, or even from documents that they produce in their company, those companies and those products are essential and necessary if you are measuring inclusion in the workplace.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. I'm glad you mentioned Textio too. I was going to ask you, I know they're my favorite tool for, changing the language and making the language in a job description more inclusive. And I know you can get at least one free trial. And I have used Textio in the past with job descriptions. For anyone who hasn't used it, you get a score on how inclusive your description is. And I think my first one, and then you get the tips to improve it and you get to rerun it. So the first time I put a job description through there, I think I went from, 63% inclusive to 98% inclusive just by taking the tips that were provided by Textio's tool. I think it's such a great point around recruitment and recruiters, anyone who's on the front line of bringing people into your company, because if you don't know what's going on in the recruiting process, if there's inclusive job descriptions, blind hiring, potentially where things like the name and the school are hidden from the resume so that bias doesn't come in during the resume review process. And of course, making sure that people are trained in some kind of unconscious bias, or at least how to reduce bias while they're interviewing. So if those barriers are there, you're not even going to get a diversity of people in the door. And then Cheryl, and I know you'll have a lot to say, how do we practice inclusion once people are in the door? Because I think what we've seen for decades is diversity programs that focus solely on hiring. People came in, they did not feel included, voices were not heard, and they left. And so you just had this continuous hole in the bucket.
Yeah. Great question, Michaela. This question is one of the reasons why I really jumped out of working in a professional job to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll tell you a little bit of a backstory. I used to build assessments for companies for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was one point where I was the head of a diversity, I'm not a fan of this term, but I have to say it because that's what it was, and cultural competency committee. And so it's called the DCC. And so I used to help create assessments that were more inclusive to get more diverse candidates in the door. Now, whether that was visible or invisible, we were measuring both. Like if a candidate needed an accommodation specifically, or as a person living with disabilities, all of these things we used to track, right? And I remember we increased our population within 3 months by almost 50% of more diverse populations, just women, people of color, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ plus populations. So I got them all in the door. After 6 months in our program, we went back and looked at that data, and the retention rate, or the turnover rate, had increased so dramatically that I was devastated when I saw the data. So literally, our director was standing in front of the room, and she presented one slide on all the amazing ways we had increased diversity. And then the next slide was like a gut punch, and she showed us the turnover rate for the different identities. And I thought to myself, oh shit. And if me cursing offends anyone, please let me know, because I tend to do it very frequently. I was like, no way. How did I miss that? Right? I was like, I'm the lead on this team. And I was so busy focused on recruitment that I didn't focus on retention. And that changed the way that we created methodologies and practices around diversity, Michaela, which is why I'm really happy that you asked me that question, because I want people to understand Your company, remember I said it practices inclusion in different levels, different degrees. One level is for recruitment and the next is for retention. And you need to balance both because you need to appreciate the people that are there and then you need to make space to be inclusive of the people that are coming in. And there's a number of ways that you do that. And the first one is you have to create some sort of way to collect information from your employees, right? I talked a lot about assessment and what that looks like, but also you need to look at your policies, your practices, and when you run data in your company. For example, if you do a pay equity assessment, you shouldn't just be looking at how much you're paying someone. You need to be breaking that down through identity, but you also need to be breaking it down through trajectory, right? And so you want to look at how long an employee has been in the workplace, how much they're getting paid. So not just your workplace, but even before they got there, right? What is their education level? And I don't mean that they have to have a formal education level. That's why you need to measure that in alignment with experience, right? Because 5 years working in a professional job can equate to 5 years of having a bachelor's degree. People don't need that, right? And so you need to evaluate those practices so that you understand how you are rewarding human beings based on their identities, even though you don't think that you are. If you have a system where you're growing in inclusion, I can guarantee you that that's happening in some way, shape, or form. Because remember, identities are not just physical. They're also invisible. It's your workplace experience. It's your gender identity. It's how long you've been in a particular position, your geographic location. All of these things matter because when you think about inclusion, you don't need a lens of equality first. You need a lens of equity because equity gets you to equality. So I'm saying this to you, for example, if you're a company who's multi-locational, okay? If you have employees that live in New York and you have employees that live in Boulder, Colorado, there's a difference between cost of living in those things. And so equity happens when you break down the trajectory of what it costs for an employee to live. And then you compare those things based on identities for how much you're paying human beings and in what job and level of promotion, right? And tenure. All of those things matter when you are trying to practice or when you're looking at whether or not you're being inclusive of employees that are already there. What are the professional development opportunities that you have created for employees? And how are you measuring their strengths and growth areas and supporting them according to that? We even have a company, I have one of our clients who we recently, about 3 months ago, instituted an accommodation request at every level of an employee's trajectory. So from the time they are a candidate to the time that they hire. Because what companies don't even think about is if you have employees who need accommodations in the interview process, right? And then how do you make sure that you have a diverse interview panel that doesn't discriminate against them because they have or they need an accommodation? But you have to think about that at every level. But to get back to answering your question directly, Michaela, your employees may need accommodations. So how are you creating a space, one, for them to tell you, and then for you to show up? Those are some of the things I think about.
Thank you. So true story that I heard. I was at a HR lunch and one of the HR leaders asked this question. She said, at my company, we have a 25-person all-male sales team and they're bringing the first onto the team. This is true. This is not a joke. And the question was, what can we do to welcome her and make her feel included?
Wow.
Yes. Yes. And we said hire 2 women. Like we didn't even know, honestly, but what would you recommend in a case like that? And I wish that was more far-flung, but I can tell you even how many startup teams I look at that it is often an all-white male team when these teams start out. So it is a reality. It might not get to 25, but it does happen.
And so let me make sure. So she's the woman on an all-male team.
The first woman hired. So the question was, we now have this woman coming on board for the first time it's a team of 25 men. What do we do?
Right. First, there's a few things you need to do because there's not one quick fix for that. The first is you better look at your policies and your practices, okay? Especially, and I have to say this, your discrimination and harassment policies and microaggression policies in the workplace, because I can guarantee you I've never had a client that had a minority of women in the workplace that didn't have issues with discrimination, microaggressions, and harassment. You need to be getting your team some education before she gets in the door. And you also need to create some norms around the ways that you operate in the workplace, because I can guarantee you feminine identities are more likely to be interrupted. And if you are a woman on a team of 7, 8, 10 men, you're going to have a hell of a time getting your voice across if you don't have an advocate or an ally in that room. And so you also need to understand, and I am saying this so blatantly to anybody who hires someone who is now the minority in their workplace, okay? It is not their job to educate you on what all women need. You do not put that responsibility on that person, whether it's a woman, whether it's a person of color, whether it's a person with a disability, it doesn't matter. It's not their job to make your workplace more inclusive. It's your leadership's, right? And that's a collective effort, not an individual effort. So I would say start there. I would also say start with her. Ask her what does she need, because maybe she wants to be a voice who goes into the workplace and advocates for women. If she wants that, then you create that space for her. But first you have to ask her what it is that she needs in order to feel like she is a part of the team and has equitable opportunity to contribute. Because just because you feel like you belong to the team doesn't mean that you yet have a space to contribute, which is why I go back and forth about the word belonging in that sense.
Very good. Thank you. So I can keep asking questions. I would love it if there are some audience questions, and this could be about anything, right? It could be about these are things on my mind. How do you advocate with your leaders if, if inclusion or DEI is not yet top of mind for them? How do you build a business case? How do you manage resistance? But really it could be, oh, I see a question. Thank you, Melissa. So Melissa's question is, what advice do you have for those of us who are trying to build solutions for employee engagement, diversity, and inclusion? Essentially, what's missing from the solutions already out there? What would you like to see in future solutions?
Great question, Melissa. Great questions. First, some of the things that I like to see are more equity-based solutions. And what I mean by that are most people, when they look for solutions, are looking for a one-size-fits-all fix, okay? And diversity is the complete opposite of that. There is no one-size-fits-all fix. And so I would say that when I'm looking for what I want to see in future solutions, I'm looking to see equity in future solutions. And what that means is the acknowledgement of diverse identities through inclusive practices that creates fair outcomes, okay? And so I say I want more diversity in solutions because I want people to get more creative about how to show up when it comes to supporting their employees. For those of you who are trying to build solutions for employee engagement and diversity and inclusion, I want to see more people do a root cause analysis, right? Because I think that we think, and I was just in Seattle before the pandemic hit, and I was talking to a company that was a trucking company, and their director of HR came in, and I'll reserve my personal opinions about him. He came into the room and he was like, well, it's all the same. We all have the same problems. We all need the same solution. So what's the solution? That's what he asked me. I said, the solution is to get different directors in HR who think differently about that first. Start there. Right? I was like, if you think that we all need the same solutions because we all have the same problems, you're part of the reason why your company's failing in DEI, right? And so I think that when you are looking at employee engagement, you have to do some root cause analysis. And what that entitles is you capturing data from your employees, you capturing data from the systems that you have in your companies, and then looking for where there's alignments and where there's gaps in the ways that those things show up in the outcomes that they produce. That could be financially, that could be professionally when it comes to an employee's career trajectory. So I would say look at your physical and invisible resources. And when I say invisible, I mean the things that you don't normally pay attention to, but that track success in your systems.
Thank you for that.
Let me see. Okay, I want to make sure. I know Melissa asked.
I know, yeah, I know, Melissa. So we had what advice for people who are building solution, and I know, Melissa, so meaning a solution provider, so someone who might be building a tool set around inclusion and engagement, finding ways for employees to connect and form relationships with each other. So if there's anything else you would add, Cheryl, just knowing that she's actually looking to provide a solution.
I would say, this is me being very transparent. Be patient but diligent, because that shit is hard. It is hard to find and build a solution. As I'm in the process of building one, some days are much more difficult than others. And so I would say my advice to you is to, one, be very aware of how your own bias might impact the things that you're looking for, but also grant yourself some grace and some patience. But let me be clear, I've said this before and I'll say this now. Patience is not waiting. Patience is what you do while you wait. And so as you are building that out, remember to be diligent in your pursuit, but to grant yourself some grace and some patience, because that's a hard thing to achieve. As I'm in the process of trying to achieve it right now.
Nice, thank you. Any other questions for Cheryl before I keep asking mine? Let's see, Kylie. Yeah, what is the most harmful mindset a person can have during DEI conversations?
That you think you know every damn thing. Shut up. That is like the most harmful thing, is a person who thinks that they know everything about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have an article that I wrote. I have a blog on Medium, and I have an article that writes it says 5 reasons why your DEI is going to die in your company. And one of the main reasons, the 2 top reasons, are power and ego. Okay? Because the most difficult thing that a person can have in their company is a resistant person who has power and influence. And so I would say that that's the most harmful thing, is to have someone in your company who is egotistical enough and thinks that they know everything and doesn't want to listen to other people. That's devastating.
Mm-hmm. And if anyone on the call has encountered such a person in their organization, what kind of conversation can they have, or what's an action that they can take?
Say that again, Michaela. I was looking at the chat.
No, that's all right. I know there's another question. If someone has encountered a person like you're describing, someone who just has a lot of ego, thinks that they know it all, or, oh, we are inclusive, we don't need to worry about this in our company, what can folks say or do in response to that?
There's a couple of things. This is the grown, very spiritual awareness Cheryl who has learned to navigate her own ego in this space, okay? And I think that one of the things you have to do is look for other like-minded people first, because you probably need a community of support, especially if that person has power. You also, for that person that thinks that they know everything, sometimes that tends to be a defense mechanism for a person who has experienced some sort of trauma in their own life, right? And so you do want to you want to grant that person some grace, because part of equity is including that person, right? But you also have to know when to stop, right? You meet people where they are and know when to walk away, and leave them there. And so I would say that, one, you find like-minded people, but also I would say create a space to listen and hear what that person has to say. When you find out what makes people tick, then y'all can talk together. Okay, that's my thing. It's like, if you know what makes someone tick, then y'all can talk together. See, like talk and talk. See what I did there?
I got it. TikTok. Cheryl's the new TikTok. I'm gonna get all your frameworks in my mind. Okay. Yeah. We had a lot of questions for in here. So I know this is something a lot of people deal with. As the manager of a small team in a large organization, are there tips that I can use to implement and start bringing more DEI into my smaller group? So maybe the whole company doesn't have an initiative, but what can someone in a leadership role do independently?
Yeah, I would say start with your group. If you are looking to bring more DEI in the company and you are willing to do it, you're probably going to be the person that sets the example, right? And so what that means is create a small budget for your team, request a budget for your team, because remember, you also, when you start in DEI, you really want to address and use the things that you can control. And if you're in a small team in a very large company, you probably have more decision-making power in that team than you do in the overall company. So I would say start there, create a budget for your team, start the conversation with your team, and create a plan for your team. Because another thing is, if you have leaderships who are resistant to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or are not so supportive of it, and you start to make small but big changes on your team, and people notice, it's going to be easier for you to create buy-in. So start there.
Yeah. I love that advice, and it just makes me think about subcultures in general. Like, I know an amazing leader who was in a generally toxic environment, but he created the best team, right? He created a very healthy, effective, productive subculture in his team with his own leadership. Now, of course, he then was a different situation. He had to act as the buffer for his team, versus the greater company, but it really was something that worked for him. And this is going to get at the budget question. I'm working at a consulting firm. We're cutting back on a lot of internal projects right now. What are recommendations for keeping DEI priorities and projects going while we don't have budget?
Ooh, this is a tough one. One more thing for Emily. I think it was Emily who asked me that question. Also, find you an executive sponsor who is in alignment with what it is that you're doing, because that will also help people to gain awareness for the things that you do. And that person speaks for you at that table where you might not be able to sit. If you are a person who you're cutting back on a lot of internal projects right now, which means I'm guessing that you're losing funding or you're not designating funding to those things, but you want to keep DEI a priority and projects going while you don't have any budget available. This is very difficult. And the reason why I say that is because diversity, equity, and inclusion requires a financial investment from your company. And so if you don't have that, there are some simple things that you can do. But Devi, I'm hoping that's how I pronounced your name correctly. Be mindful of the fact that those things may not have as much of an impact. One of our companies right now, I was on a call with one of our companies yesterday, and they cut their budget for diversity, equity, and inclusion because they had to, right? And so one of the things that we've started in their platform is an online employee storytelling. So what that means is that employees from different identities weekly come on and share their stories for how they have felt included in the company, but also spaces where they'd like to see improvement based on the identities that they have. Because if your DEI budget is cut, but people are thinking about it, the thing that you don't want to lose is the awareness, right? And so you want to continue to create conversations and spaces where people can have those moments of sharing, right? And so that's one that you can create it. Also, if you don't have the budget, right now is a hell of a time to create a plan. So if you're thinking about running DEI, you might want to run an assessment through a tool that you have in your company, or you might want to get on the phone and talk to employees about what their needs are in spaces in relation to your business case. Because the goal right now is for you to create awareness and collect information and then to plan so that when you come out of this phase, you're ready to meet it, full force with all the preparation that you've done. So this is a great time to do that.
Nice. Thank you. And Audra asked this question, and I am guilty of this one. How do we break the habit of referencing you guys that comes from pretty much everyone?
Yes, practice. I will say that, we often see these are the two areas where we see the most linguistic challenge in companies comes from masculine language and non-inclusive LGBTQ language, especially when it comes to gender identity, right? And so one of the things you have to do is create inclusive language across your company. That means that you are creating norms in your meeting. That means that when you create marketing material, when you send an email, you have an idea of what it means to have inclusive language. So there's ways you replace you guys with you all or everyone, or if you're from the Midwest like me, I say y'all. But you have to write those things down and you have to practice them daily, because remember, if you're like me and you've been on this earth for decades, you've probably used language like that for a very long time. You're not going to break it overnight, but you need to start to create more awareness and practice around that. And you do that through repetition. And you also do that through eliminating your own bias, because remember, even the bias around gender identity that we have can be unconscious. And so as you are looking at things on television that are more inclusive, if you're reading literature that's by men or mostly by masculine identities, you want to start to incorporate literature by feminine or non-gender binary or identities, right? Because the language within those is different. I'm reading a book right now that was written in 1951. And every time he gives an example in this damn book, he says, man. And I take notes. I'm the person that I have to journal when I read. And so I find myself changing the language when I'm writing it to say either human or people. And so it takes practices like that to get there.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing I've seen, if it's a friendly group and someone wants to do a buzzer, like I saw a group do this when they were presenting on a panel, and someone would just kind of do the like buzzer sound. If someone said God, the other one is create a pool. You know, you have to throw in $1 or something every time you say it. Just different incentives to change the habits.
Yeah, because a great example, Michaela, because remember, rewards and consequences influence our behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't think about that, but everything that you do, you receive a reward and a consequence, even if the reward is the absence of consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, you create rewards and consequences in order to reinforce positive change.
Yeah, well said. Next question about, this actually, I love this topic too, ERGs. What is your opinion of business resource groups? I came from a large company that had a very active and strong groups, and I just launched a women's group at our company last year. It's new to many people, and it's been received with mixed results.
Yes. I'll tell you that for business resource groups, employee inclusion groups, employee resource groups, whatever we are calling them, I mean, some of them serve different purposes. So let me be clear that a business resource group is not necessarily the same thing as an employee resource group. Alexa, I would love for you to tell me, is business resource group a group that's based on a shared identity of employees in order to meet a business case? Because if it's a shared identity, it's an employee resource group, it's an ERG. But if it's a business resource group, then it's a group of people that come together that don't necessarily have to have the same identity, and they're there to help a company meet some sort of goal or outcome in order to keep the business sustainable. Those are very different. So I just want to be clear on which one it is, Alexa, that you're asking me about.
And you can chat, Alexa, or you can also just unmute, feel free.
Okay, an employee resource
Either
group.
way.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. So employee resource groups, there's pros and there's cons to them. And the cons usually come not because their existence is a bad idea, but just because the way they're structured is not efficient and effective. So I think that when employee resource groups form, the first thing they need to learn is how to become a high functioning employee resource group. What that means is that you have some sort of structure. It doesn't mean that you have to have a president or a secretary or any of that, but you need to have a purpose on why you exist, and you need to have a plan for how you're going to accomplish that purpose, right? And you need to have some sort of structure formatted. Like, is there going to be 20 people in your group? Are you going to have open enrollment? Are you going to allow allies? Because remember, an employee resource group should have multiple positions. It should have people who are members, then it should have people who are affiliates and allies, and even sponsors who are supporting you, right? And so when you create an employee resource group, usually when they're formed because people need a space to feel safe in the workplace because they feel like they're not being treated fairly for whatever reason. And so these marginalized groups tend to come together and say, we feel like we're not being treated fairly in the workplace, and we want to do something so that we get the same equal outcomes through equity that other groups have that we see excelling beyond us or receiving opportunity and not us. And so I think that if you create a group like that, it should, you need a space to vent and gossip, but that shouldn't be the only thing that your employee resource group does. We tend to see with employee resource groups, employees go there and they vent. And you should have a space for that. You should have a time for that, but that should not be your purpose, right? You can do that at a bar after you leave work. You don't need an employee resource group to do that. But if you are creating an ERG, think about how you're going to be chartered in the organization, because when you are chartered and people recognize you, you get more support. And in order to create a charter, you need a formal structure or some sort of article of operation in order to be able to do that. Then you need to have a vision and a purpose that meets the needs of your group. And then you need to create a plan. And then you need to have someone who is sponsoring you that has some influence and impact and actually gives a shit about the people in your group, right? So if you do all that, you're on your way to becoming a highly effective employee resource group. And if you don't, then you're not. And people, what that does is it can harm you if you create an employee resource group and all you do is go there and complain, right? Because then your leadership's looking at you like you're not being impactful, you're not meeting an ROI. All you do is complain, but you don't have any solutions. You know, you'd be surprised how many times we hear that from executives who ask us to come in and train their ERGs. And so I'm telling you to get all four of those things in order to get off to a more efficient and impactful start.
That's great. Thank you, Cheryl. And thanks for clarifying ERG versus BRG. I wasn't really familiar with the BRG. Question from Gail. What recommendations do you have for someone who's just starting to learn about or get into DEI?
A couple of things. Approach it with some humility and some authenticity. I think that often sometimes when we get into DEI, if you especially, this is very prevalent, so I'm not saying that it's anything that may have happened with you, Gail, but we see in companies, the people who usually get put into DEI positions that are not actually hired externally are internal people who are people from marginalized identities that they expect to fix the problems that they've created in a company, right, without giving you adequate support. And so if you are just starting to get into DEI and learn about DEI, first thing you need to do is really educate yourself on why you are there. What is your why, right? Why are you doing that work? And then I would say, look at why it is that you got into DEI after you examined your why and what you need to do in order to fix that why so that it doesn't happen for other people. Because usually most of our whys are based on purpose out of pain. And I learned that through a book that I read that talked about, you know, what is your why? And so if that is the case, the reason I'm bringing that up is because I've been in a space where pain has taught me my pain has overshadowed the pain of other people. And so when I approached DEI initially about 17 years ago, I came into it with the lens that I was going to fix what was happening to Black women in the world. And then I got into a space where I created more awareness around other challenges that other human beings were having from the same institutions that created our challenges, right? And so when you go into it with the mind frame of actually being inclusive, make sure that you can pick a lane to stay in, but don't crash over into someone else's lane trying to fix and stay in yours. So I would say that would be my recommendation for you. But also get you some great literature. There are some great books out there about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Jennifer Brown has a couple of good books about how to become an inclusive leader and inclusion in the workplace, which is a really great book. There's a book by Justin Brown that's called Not Just Another Diversity Book. I really like it. And then there's a ton of reports and things out there. There's a ton of data out there for you that I would recommend you go look at to understand what areas of DEI we are really, really, that are really in need of solutions right now. And it's all of them.
Nice, thank you. Before I get to Melissa's next question, since I know some people are gonna have to start dropping off, we did want to let you know a few things. So one is we do have another AMA coming up. It's about keeping remote teams engaged, and the title is to do with it smells like team spirit. So we're gonna have a little fun. We have Bridget Quigg, who's a comedian. She does stand-up and improv. She's gonna join us for that. And then also about 8 of our coaches on the Reverb team have pulled together to offer some free one-on-one spot coaching, just 30-minute sessions for anyone who is struggling in any way, personally or professionally, as we go through this pandemic together. So I think Kylie's gonna link as well, and everybody is free. Sign up for a spot and share the link if you know somebody who could benefit from that. And I'm gonna go to this last, is such a kind question from Melissa. Cheryl, what are your goals for Inclusology and how can we help support you?
Hi, my Dr. Evil polls. Right now, there's a couple of things. I'm in the midst of raising $1 million seed round. So we have a campaign right now on iFund Women to help us get to product launch. So if you go on ifundwomen.com/project/Inclusology, you can support our campaign. If you know investors who are interested in one, big data analytics or people analytics or social impact, please send them our way. And go follow us on all of our social media because we always post things on there. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of it's Inclusology because I trademarked that word, so it belongs to my company, but you'll always find us under Inclusology. We're the only one that uses that term.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna tech tip myself. If you are scrambling to do something with all of these links and everything that's been typed into the chat, You can either copy paste it, or if you open your chat, click on the 3 dots and save the chat. So you'll have all of those resources for the future. Cheryl, any parting words before we go here today?
Yes, one thing I tweeted about this the other day, and I do want to talk about this, especially as we're in the midst of a global pandemic. I think that people are saying, when is the world going to get back to business as usual? And I think that this is a really great time for us to create a new normal around the workplace. And so I would say my ask to you is, as you are in your workplaces and you're thinking about business as usual, um, don't so much think about the norms that you already have, but think about creating a new normal and one that's more inclusive. Because I think what our society has proven right now is that we are in the space of creating accommodations and support when we need to. And that needs to be how we function all the time. And so if you're a person who's going back into the workplace or looking to go back into the workplace, go back into it with that lens, because that's the thing that's really going to help to inform DEI if and when you start it back up.
Yeah, well said. Thank you so much. And folks, we'd love your feedback. We're not doing any kind of surveys, but if you have feedback, shoot it to any one of us. If you have our email or on LinkedIn, or just send a note to info@reverbpeople.com. Also, if there are some future topics that you'd like us to address or talk about, we'd love for you to share those as well. All right, thanks everyone. And I think most of you are probably in the Seattle area with the exception of Cheryl, so get out there and enjoy the sunshine.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Michaela. Thank you, team, Lindsay, especially Kylie, for posting this information. Thank you all, and I will see y'all next week. We have a date.
Yes, we do. See you, Cheryl. Thank you so much.
See you soon.
All right. Hey, bye, everybody, and thanks a lot for joining. Really appreciate it. Bye.